The dust on the horizon danced like ghosts in the late afternoon sun, as Madeline Zephyr knelt before the weathered wooden cross that marked her father's final resting place. Her long auburn hair, once carefully pinned up, now fell loose around her shoulders, moving with the relentless Wyoming wind of 1876. She had been there since sunrise, one hand clutching her father's worn Bible, the other tracing the crude letters carved into the marker. The lonesome trail stretched before and behind her, but Madeline remained still, a solitary figure in a vast and unforgiving landscape. Xavier Calloway spotted her from nearly half a mile away, a splash of faded blue calico against the golden-brown prairie grass. He hadn't expected to find anyone on this seldom-traveled stretch between Laramie and Cheyenne. His horse, a sturdy palomino named Buck, snorted as Xavier gently guided him toward the curious sight of a woman alone beside a grave marker. As he approached, Xavier could see the woman's shoulders trembling slightly, though she made no sound. Her dress was dusty but well-made, and a small leather satchel lay beside her. The grave was fresh, perhaps only days old. Xavier dismounted silently, removing his hat in respect. Without a word, he sat beside her, leaving enough distance to be proper but close enough that his presence would be felt. For nearly 10 minutes, neither spoke. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the prairie grass and the occasional soft nickering of his horse. Xavier didn't rush her. Out here, time moved differently and some moments deserved their space. "He was all I had left," Madeline finally said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the evidence of tears on her cheeks. "My father, we were heading to Oregon." She didn't look at Xavier as she spoke, her gaze fixed on the crude cross. Xavier nodded, turning the brim of his hat in his weathered hands. "A hard country to cross alone," he said simply. "I'm not entirely alone," Madeline replied. "I have his memory." She finally turned to look at the stranger beside her, taking in his sun-browned face, the kind eyes that seemed at odds with the gun belt slung low on his hips. "I'm Madeline Zephyr." "Xavier Calloway," he replied with a slight nod. "Most folks call me Zav." He glanced at the grave marker, then back at her. "How long you been sitting here, Miss Zephyr?" "Since this morning," she admitted. "I buried him yesterday, typhoid fever, it took him so quickly." Her voice trailed off. "I don't know where to go now, our wagon is just over that rise, the oxen." She gestured vaguely toward the west. Xavier followed her gesture with his eyes. "Your animals need tending," he stated, not unkindly. "And so do you, I reckon. Are you suggesting I leave him here?" Madeline's voice suddenly took on an edge. "No, madam," Xavier said, his voice gentle. "I'm suggesting you honor him by surviving. Can't do that if you waste away beside this cross." Madeline brushed a strand of hair from her face, leaving a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "I don't even know which way to go anymore. Oregon was his dream." Xavier stood up slowly, dusting off his denim pants. "First things first, let's see to your wagon and animals, then we can talk about where you might head." He offered her a hand. "If you'll allow me to help." Madeline looked at his extended hand for a long moment. She had been raised to be cautious of strangers, especially in this wild country. But there was something in Xavier's steady gaze that spoke of reliability. With a deep breath, she placed her hand in his and allowed him to help her to her feet. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." "Just Zav, if you don't mind." He gave her hand a gentle squeeze before releasing it. "Let's get you settled before nightfall." As they walked toward her wagon, Madeline cast one last glance at her father's grave. "Goodbye, Papa," she whispered, touching the worn Bible to her heart. "I'll make you proud." Xavier pretended not to notice as he led his horse alongside her. The sun was beginning its descent toward the distant mountains, and there was much to do before darkness claimed the land. Madeline's wagon was in fair condition, though the canvas cover had seen better days. 2 oxen stood in their yokes, looking thinner than they should. A single mule was tethered nearby, nibbling listlessly at the sparse grass. "They haven't been properly watered since yesterday morning," Madeline admitted as Xavier immediately went to check on the animals. "I couldn't bring myself to leave him." Xavier nodded without judgment. "There's a creek about half a mile yonder," he said, pointing north. "We can move your camp there for the night." He efficiently began unhitching the oxen. "These fellows need rest and food, but they'll pull through." The mule looked sturdy enough. Madeline watched him work, his movements practiced and sure. "You know your way around animals." "Raised on a ranch in Texas," Xavier explained, not looking up from his task. "Worked as a drover, then a scout. Lately I've been carrying messages between army posts." He finally glanced up at her. "What brought you and your father out here?" "My father was a schoolteacher in Philadelphia," Madeline said, moving to help untangle a bit of harness. "After my mother died last winter, he couldn't bear to stay. Said he wanted to see the great forests of Oregon before he grew too old." A sad smile touched her lips. "He'd read about the land in books all his life, but never seen it with his own eyes." Xavier's expression softened. "A learned man, then." "He taught me everything I know," Madeline said proudly. "Languages, mathematics, literature. He believed a woman's mind deserved education as much as a man's." "A wise fellow," Xavier commented. "You can read and write well, then?" "Yes, of course." Xavier nodded thoughtfully. "That's valuable out here. Not many have those skills." He finished with the oxen and moved to check the wagon's wheels. "We'll get you to that creek, set up proper camp. Tomorrow we can decide what's best for you." As Madeline gathered her few personal items from beside her father's grave, she felt a curious mix of guilt and relief. The idea of moving forward seemed like a betrayal, yet her father would never have wanted her to waste away in grief. With Xavier leading the oxen and Madeline driving the wagon, they made their way slowly to the creek he had mentioned. The spot was prettier than she expected, a ribbon of clear water winding through a small grove of cottonwoods, offering both water and shelter. Xavier helped her set up camp with an efficiency that spoke of years of experience in the wilderness. As darkness fell, they sat beside a small fire. Xavier had produced coffee from his saddlebags and brewed a strong pot that Madeline gratefully accepted. The night was cool but not uncomfortable, the stars emerging like diamond dust scattered across the heavens. "Have you always traveled alone, Mr. Calloway?" Madeline asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Zav," he corrected gently. "And yes, mostly, easier that way, easier." "It seems terribly lonely." Xavier looked into the fire. "Lonesome at times," he acknowledged, "but a man gets used to his own company." "My father used to say that solitude is good for the soul, but only in small doses," Madeline said. "He believed people were meant to share their lives." Xavier's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Your father sounds like he had a way with words." "He did." Madeline sipped her coffee, the warmth spreading through her tired body. "What will happen tomorrow, Zav? I have no family left, nowhere specific to go." Xavier considered her question carefully. "Cheyenne's about 4 days' journey from here. It's growing fast, might be opportunities there for someone with education. Or you could continue west, though I wouldn't recommend traveling alone." Madeline nodded slowly. "I have some money, not much, but something." "We'll figure it out," Xavier said with quiet confidence. "Get some rest now, you're safe here." As Madeline settled into her small tent, she was surprised to realize she believed him. For the first time since her father fell ill, she felt a small flicker of hope. Sleep came quickly, dreamless and deep. The morning dawned clear and warm. Madeline emerged from her tent to find Xavier already tending the animals and brewing fresh coffee. He had also managed to catch 2 rabbits, which were now cooking over the rekindled fire. "You've been busy," Madeline observed, splashing creek water on her face to wash away the last remnants of sleep. "Early riser," Xavier said with a shrug. "Habit from army days." He handed her a tin cup of coffee. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I expected," she admitted. "Thank you for your kindness, Zav. I'm not sure what I would have done if you hadn't come along." Xavier looked slightly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Madeline said firmly, "not anyone. Most would have ridden past." They ate breakfast in comfortable silence. Afterward, Xavier helped Madeline take inventory of her supplies. The wagon contained enough food to last a couple of weeks if they were careful, along with her father's books, clothing, and a few household items intended for their new life in Oregon. "Your father planned well," Xavier observed as they sorted through the supplies. "These provisions will see you to Cheyenne easily." "Us," Madeline raised an eyebrow. "Will you be accompanying me then?" Xavier hesitated. "If you'd like the company, I was headed to Cheyenne anyway." He didn't mention that his original destination had been Fort Laramie in the opposite direction. Relief flooded Madeline's expression. "I would be grateful for your escort, Mr. Calloway." "Just Zav," he reminded her with a small smile. "We should get moving. We can make about 10 miles today if we start soon." As they prepared to depart, Madeline found herself watching Xavier as he efficiently packed up their camp. He moved with the easy grace of a man accustomed to the physical demands of frontier life, but there was a gentleness to him that belied his rugged appearance. Despite her grief, she couldn't help but notice how his shirt stretched across broad shoulders as he lifted heavy items, or how his eyes crinkled at the corners when he offered one of his rare smiles. For his part, Xavier found himself increasingly aware of Madeline's quiet strength. She worked alongside him without complaint, clearly exhausted but determined. When she occasionally spoke of her father, her voice carried love and respect rather than just sorrow. She was grieving but not broken. They set out by mid-morning, Xavier riding alongside the wagon as Madeline handled the reins with surprising skill. The trail stretched before them, winding through rolling grasslands dotted with wildflowers. In the distance, the mountains stood like sentinels against the vast blue sky. "Have you been to Cheyenne before?" Xavier asked after they had been traveling for a few hours. "No, never," Madeline replied. "Father and I came west by train as far as Laramie, then joined a wagon train. When he fell ill, the others couldn't wait." She didn't say it with bitterness, just stating a fact of frontier life. "It's growing fast," Xavier said. "The railroads brought all sorts merchants, laborers, families, even some fine ladies from back east trying to civilize the place." Madeline smiled slightly. "And has it worked?" "The civilizing," Xavier chuckled, a warm sound that surprised her. There's proper shops now, a school, even a theater of sorts, still plenty rough around the edges, though." "And what will you do there?" Madeline asked. Xavier was silent for a moment. "Pick up some work, most likely." "I've been thinking of settling down somewhere eventually, getting tired of constant moving." "A man of your skills would be valuable anywhere," Madeline observed. "Kind of you to say." Xavier adjusted his hat against the sun. "What about you? What will you do in Cheyenne?" Madeline considered the question. "I could teach, perhaps. Father always said I had a gift for it." She sighed. "Though I admit the idea of standing in front of a classroom without him nearby for guidance is frightening." "You'll find your way," Xavier said with conviction. "Folks who can bring learning to children are always needed out here." They made good progress that day, stopping occasionally to rest the animals and once for a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. By late afternoon, Xavier pointed out a suitable camping spot near a small spring. They worked together to set up camp, falling into an easy rhythm as if they'd been traveling companions for years rather than a day. After a supper of beans and the last of the rabbit, they sat by the fire as the stars began to appear. The night was peaceful, with only the occasional distant howl of a coyote to remind them of the wilderness surrounding them. "May I ask you something, Zav?" Madeline's voice was soft in the gathering darkness. "Of course. Why did you stop yesterday, when you saw me by the cross?" Xavier poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise toward the night sky. "Wouldn't be right to pass by someone in need." "Is that all?" Madeline pressed gently. Xavier was quiet for so long that Madeline thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "I lost someone once. Sat by their grave for 3 days before I could move on. No one stopped for me." He met her eyes across the fire. "I know what it's like to be alone with grief." The simple honesty of his words touched something deep within Madeline. "Who did you lose?" she asked softly. "My brother, Jacob." Younger than me by 2 years, we were riding with a cattle drive when Comanche is attacked. Xavier's voice remained steady, but his eyes reflected old pain. I couldn't get to him in time. I'm sorry, Madeline said, meaning it. How old were you? 22. He was 20. Xavier shrugged as if to dismiss the memory. It was a long time ago. Some hurts don't fade with time, Madeline observed. They just become part of us. Xavier nodded, seeming to appreciate that she didn't offer empty platitudes. Get some rest, Madeline. Tomorrow will be another long day. As she retired to her tent, Madeline found herself thinking about the quiet cowboy who had so unexpectedly entered her life. There was more to Xavier Calloway than met the eye depth and character behind his laconic manner. For the first time since her father's death, she found herself curious about what tomorrow might bring. The next 3 days fell into a pattern. They would rise with the sun, eat a simple breakfast, and travel until the heat of the day became too much for the animals. During the afternoon rest, Xavier would sometimes hunt small game while Madeline read aloud from one of her father's books. They would travel a few more hours before making camp for the night. During these days, Madeline began to notice subtle changes in their interaction. Xavier spoke more freely, occasionally even sharing stories from his varied life experiences. He had been a cowhand, a scout for the army during the last Indian Wars, a sometime deputy in small frontier towns. He never boasted about his adventures but recounted them matter-of-factly when she asked. For her part, Madeline found herself smiling more. The raw edge of her grief was still present, but it no longer consumed her every waking moment. She told Xavier about growing up in Philadelphia, about her mother's quiet strength and her father's boundless curiosity. She found herself laughing at memories that just days before would have brought only tears. On the evening of the third day, as they sat beside their campfire, Xavier surprised her by saying, "You have a fine laugh, Madeline." She felt a flush creep into her cheeks. "Do I? You do." He seemed almost embarrassed by his own observation. "It's good to hear it." "I didn't think I would laugh again so soon after Father died," she admitted. "I feel guilty sometimes, finding any joy when he's gone." Xavier looked thoughtful. "My mother used to say that joy honors those we've lost more than sorrow ever could. That finding reasons to smile means their life mattered enough to give us happiness even after they're gone." "Your mother sounds wise," Madeline said softly. "She was." Xavier smiled faintly. "Tough as rawhide but gentle-hearted. Is she still living?" Xavier shook his head. "Passed on 5 years ago, consumption." "You've lost a great deal," Madeline observed, "as have you." Xavier's eyes met hers across the fire. "But we go on." The simple statement held no self-pity, just quiet acceptance of life's harsh realities. Madeline found herself admiring his resilience and realizing with a start that her admiration was turning into something more complex. That night, as Madeline lay in her tent listening to the night sounds, she acknowledged to herself that she was developing feelings for the quiet cowboy who had come to her aid. The realization was both frightening and exhilarating. It had been only 4 days since they met, yet she felt as if she'd known him much longer. Was it merely gratitude, or something more substantial? The 4th day dawned with dark clouds gathering on the horizon. Xavier frowned at the sky as he saddled Buck. "Storm's coming," he said when Madeline emerged from her tent. "We should try to reach Cheyenne before it hits." "How far?" Madeline asked, quickly helping to break camp. "About 15 miles. We'll need to push harder than we have been." They set out at a brisk pace, Xavier frequently scanning the darkening western sky. The wind picked up as the morning progressed, carrying the scent of rain. The oxen sensed the approaching storm and grew restless, requiring Madeline's full attention to keep them steady. By midday, the first raindrops began to fall. Xavier rode close to the wagon, his face set in lines of concern. "We're still about 8 miles out," he called over the increasing wind. "This is going to hit hard before we make it." As if in confirmation, a jagged bolt of lightning split the sky, followed by a crack of thunder that made the oxen bellow in fear. The rain began to fall in earnest, heavy drops quickly turning to sheets of water that reduced visibility to mere yards. "There's an old line shack about a mile east," Xavier shouted. "Used by the Circle T Ranch hands. We should head there." Madeline nodded, already soaked to the skin despite her oilskin coat. Xavier took the lead, guiding them off the main trail toward a low rise barely visible through the downpour. The wagon wheels slipped in the rapidly forming mud, making progress painfully slow. Another lightning strike, closer this time, sent the oxen into a panic. The wagon lurched violently as they tried to bolt. "Whoa," Madeline called, fighting for control. Xavier was instantly beside her, reaching over to grab the reins and add his strength to hers. Together they managed to calm the frightened animals enough to keep moving forward. After what seemed like hours but was likely only 20 minutes, a small, weathered cabin came into view. It was little more than a shack, but to Madeline, it looked like salvation itself. Xavier jumped down from his horse and quickly led the oxen and wagon to the lee side of the building, where a crude lean-to offered some protection from the elements. "Get inside," he called to Madeline over the howling wind. "I'll see to the animals." Madeline didn't argue. She grabbed her satchel and made a dash for the cabin door, pushing it open against the force of the wind. The interior was dim and dusty but mercifully dry. A small iron stove stood in one corner, and rough bunks lined the walls. She quickly found a lantern hanging from a nail and managed to light it with shaking hands. Several minutes later, Xavier burst through the door, bringing a gust of wind and rain with him. He was drenched from head to toe, his hat doing little to keep the water from his face. He pushed the door shut against the storm and stood for a moment, catching his breath. "Animals are secure," he reported, removing his dripping hat. "Got them under the lean-to and threw some feed bags on. They'll weather it fine." "Thank you," Madeline said, suddenly conscious of her own bedraggled appearance. Her dress clung to her uncomfortably and her hair hung in wet ropes around her face. "You're soaked through." "As are you," Xavier observed with a slight smile. "Let's get that stove going before we catch our death." He moved to the stove and, finding it already stocked with wood, quickly had a fire blazing. The small cabin began to warm almost immediately. Xavier pulled off his wet coat and hung it near the stove, then did the same with his vest. He kept his back politely turned as Madeline removed her own outer layers. "There's a blanket on that bunk," he said, nodding toward the corner. "You should wrap up in it while your clothes dry." Madeline retrieved the rough woolen blanket, grateful for its warmth despite its musty smell. "Do you think the storm will pass quickly?" Xavier moved to the single small window and peered out. "Hard to say. These prairie storms can blow over in an hour or last all day." He turned back to her. "We're safe here, though. Plenty of firewood, and I saw some basic provisions in the chuck box." As if to emphasize their predicament, a tremendous clap of thunder shook the cabin, making Madeline jump. Xavier gave her a reassuring smile. "Just the storm talking," he said. "Nothing to fear." Madeline nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I've never seen such weather." In Philadelphia, storms were tame by comparison. "The West doesn't do anything halfway," Xavier said, finding a coffee pot among the cabin's supplies and setting water to boil on the stove. "Not its beauty, not its dangers, and certainly not its storms." They settled into the cabin's routine, making coffee and finding a small supply of beans and salt pork in the chuck box. Xavier prepared a simple meal while Madeline hung their wet clothing near the stove to dry. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, a strange domestic tranquility took hold. As they ate their meal, sitting on opposite bunks with their tin plates balanced on their knees, Madeline found herself studying Xavier's face in the warm glow of the lantern. With his guard down and his attention on his food, she could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting against the sun, the small scar above his right eyebrow, the way his dark hair curled slightly when damp. "How old are you, Xav?" she asked suddenly, curious about the man who had become so important to her in such a short time. He looked up, surprised by the question. 34 come November. Why do you ask? Just curious, Madeline said, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. I realized I didn't know, and you. If it's not impolite to ask a lady her age. 26, she answered. Though father always said I have an old soul. Xavier nodded thoughtfully. You carry yourself with more dignity than most I've met, regardless of age. He set his empty plate aside. Were you ever married back east? The question surprised her. No, she answered honestly. There was someone once, a fellow teacher at father's school. We were close for a time. She looked down at her plate. But when mother died and father decided to go west, Thomas wasn't willing to leave Philadelphia. He had his career, his family. She shrugged. I chose to stay with father. Do you regret it? Xavier's voice was gentle. Madeline considered the question seriously. No, she said finally. I loved Thomas, but not enough to put him above my father's needs, and father needed me. She looked up at Xavier. What about you? No wife waiting somewhere? A shadow crossed his face. There was someone once, in a small town near Fort Laramie. He hesitated, as if deciding how much to share. Her name was Sarah. We were to be married 3 years ago. When he didn't continue, Madeline prompted softly. What happened? Influenza, Xavier said, his voice flat. Swept through the town one winter. Took her and her whole family in less than a week. I'm sorry, Madeline said, the words feeling inadequate against such loss. Xavier nodded his acknowledgement of her sympathy. After that, I went back to wandering. Seemed easier than staying in one place with all those memories. The rain continued to beat against the cabin roof, a steady drumming that filled the silence between them. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, the wind howling around the cabin's corners like a living thing. We should probably try to rest, Xavier said eventually, rising to add more wood to the stove. No telling how long we'll be weather-bound. Madeline agreed, though she felt far from sleepy despite the day's exertions. They arranged themselves on opposite bunks, Xavier insisting she take the one furthest from the door where drafts were less likely to reach her. He extinguished the lantern, leaving only the red glow of the stove to illuminate the small space. Xav, Madeline's voice was soft in the darkness. Yes, thank you, not just for today, but for everything since we met. There was a pause before he replied, No need for thanks, Madeline. I'm glad our paths crossed. So am I, she whispered, not sure if he heard her as another roll of thunder shook the cabin. Despite her expectation of lying awake, the warmth of the cabin and the rhythmic sound of the rain soon lulled Madeline into sleep. She dreamed of her father, not as she had last seen him pale and consumed by fever, but as he had been in his prime, laughing as he pointed out constellations in the night sky. In the dream, he looked at her with eyes full of love and said, Follow your heart, Maddie, it always knows the way home. She woke to gray morning light filtering through the cabin's small window. The rain had stopped, though water still dripped from the eaves. Xavier was already up, stoking the fire in the stove and setting water to boil for coffee. Morning, he said when he noticed her stirring. Storm's passed, but it's left quite a mess. The trail will be muddy for miles. Madeline sat up, running a hand through her tangled hair. Will we still try for Cheyenne today? Xavier nodded. If you're up to it, the going will be slow, but we should make it by sundown. They shared a breakfast of coffee and the last of the beans, then set about gathering their now dry clothing and preparing to depart. Outside, the world had been transformed by the storm. Puddles reflected the clearing sky, and everything seemed washed clean. The oxen and Xavier's horse looked none the worse for their night under the lean-to. As they prepared to leave, Xavier took a moment to replenish the wood beside the stove and leave some of their coffee and jerky in the chuck box. For the next traveler caught in a storm, he explained when Madeline questioned him. It's the way out here, you take what you need and leave what you can. The simple code of frontier ethics touched Madeline deeply. It spoke of a community created not by proximity, but by shared understanding of the land's harshness and beauty. They set out with the sun climbing steadily higher, burning away the last of the storm clouds. The trail was indeed muddy, the wagon wheels occasionally sinking deep enough to require both of them pushing while the oxen strained forward. Despite these challenges, they made steady progress toward Cheyenne. As they traveled, Madeline found herself increasingly aware of the approaching town and what it might mean for their companionship. Would Xavier simply see her safely there and continue on his way? The thought created an unexpected ache in her chest. "What will you do once we reach Cheyenne?" she asked during one of their brief rest stops. Xavier looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That depends," he said carefully. "On what? On whether there's reason enough to stay." His eyes held her steadily. Madeline's heart quickened at his words and the implication behind them. "I would like it if you stayed," she said softly, "at least until I get settled." A small smile touched Xavier's lips. "Then I'll stay." The simple exchange contained more meaning than the words themselves, an unspoken understanding growing between them. As they resumed their journey, Madeline felt a new lightness in her heart. The future, which had seemed so bleak just days ago, now held possibilities she hadn't dared to consider. By late afternoon, they caught their first glimpse of Cheyenne in the distance, a sprawling collection of buildings rising from the prairie, dominated by the railroad station with its billowing smoke. Compared to Philadelphia, it was hardly more than a large village, but to Madeline, after days on the trail, it looked like a metropolis. "There it is," Xavier said, riding closer to the wagon. "Cheyenne, not pretty, but it's growing fast." As they approached, the sounds of the town reached them: the distant whistle of a locomotive, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the general hum of human activity. After the silence of the prairie, it seemed almost overwhelming. They entered town as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the muddy Main Street. Buildings lined both sides: saloons and merchants, a hotel, a barber shop, the sheriff's office. People moved about their business, a few pausing to glance at the newcomers, but most too engaged in their own concerns to pay much attention. Xavier directed them toward a modest boarding house on a side street, explaining that it was run by a widow who was known for her fair prices and clean rooms. As they drew up in front, a stout woman with gray streaked hair emerged onto the porch. "Mr. Calloway," she called in greeting, "didn't expect to see you back so soon." "Mrs. Thornton," Xavier tipped his hat politely, "had a change of plans. This is Miss Madeline Zephyr. She's looking for lodging, and there's no place I'd recommend more highly than yours." Mrs. Thornton's shrewd eyes took in Madeline's travel-worn appearance and the wagon behind her. "Just yourself, miss?" "Yes," Madeline confirmed, a shadow crossing her face as she thought of her father. "Just me." "Well, you're in luck. I've got a small room available, very respectable. $5 a week, includes breakfast and supper." Mrs. Thornton's businesslike manner was tempered with kindness. "There's a stable around back where your animals can be kept for an extra $1. "Thank you," Madeline said gratefully. "That would be perfect." Xavier helped Madeline with her trunk and satchel, carrying them up to the small but clean room on the boarding house's second floor. Mrs. Thornton followed, explaining house rules and meal times as they went. "Supper's at 6 sharp," she concluded. "You've time for a wash-up before then. Bathrooms down the hall, water's heated." When Mrs. Thornton departed, Madeline turned to Xavier, suddenly awkward. "Will you join us for supper? If Mrs. Thornton doesn't object, I'd be honored," he replied. "I'll see to the animals and clean up a bit myself. Been too long on the trail to present myself at a lady's table without some attention to appearances." After he left, Madeline took advantage of the promised hot water to wash away the dust of travel. She changed into her one remaining clean dress, a simple blue cotton that had been packed at the bottom of her trunk. As she pinned up her hair, she found herself wondering what Xavier would think of her appearance now that she wasn't covered in trail dust. The thought made her blush. Was she truly developing such feelings for him after less than a week's acquaintance? Yet there was no denying the flutter in her stomach when she thought of him, or the way her eyes sought him out whenever they were together. At 6 o'clock, Madeline made her way downstairs to the boarding house dining room. 3 other boarders were already seated, an older gentleman who introduced himself as Dr. Palmer, a young clerk named Mr. Simmons, and Miss Holloway, a seamstress who worked at the dressmaker's shop down the street. Xavier arrived moments later, and Madeline's breath caught at the transformation. He had shaved and changed into a clean shirt and vest. His dark hair was neatly combed, though still a bit too long by Eastern standards. He looked, she realized with a start, remarkably handsome. His eyes found hers immediately, and something in his expression told her that he appreciated the change in her appearance as well. He took the empty chair beside her, offering polite greetings to the other boarders. Mrs. Thornton served a hearty meal of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. The conversation flowed easily around the table, with the other boarders curious about Madeline's background and plans. "A teacher, you say?" Dr. Palmer looked interested. "As it happens, Cheyenne is in desperate need of educators. The town council just approved funding for a proper schoolhouse last month. Until now, classes have been held in the back room of the church, with volunteers doing what they can." "Really?" Madeline felt a spark of excitement. "Do you know who I should speak with about a position?" "Mayor Hendricks would be your best bet," Mr. Simmons offered. "His office is above the general store. He's usually there mornings till noon." Xavier remained mostly quiet during this exchange, but Madeline noticed the small smile of approval on his face. After dinner, he excused himself, explaining that he needed to arrange his own lodging for the night. "There's a room above the livery," he told Madeline as they stood in the boarding house foyer. "The owner's an old acquaintance." "Will I see you tomorrow?" Madeline couldn't keep the hope from her voice. "Count on it," Xavier replied. "I'll come by in the morning, walk you to the mayor's office if you'd like." "I would like that very much." Their eyes held for a moment longer than was strictly proper. Then Xavier tipped his hat and stepped out into the evening, leaving Madeline with a curious mixture of anticipation and longing. That night, as she lay in a real bed for the first time in weeks, Madeline found her thoughts continually returning to Xavier. In the span of 5 days, he had become central to her world. Was it merely the circumstances of their meeting, or was there something deeper growing between them? She thought of the way he had sat beside her at her father's grave, offering silent comfort. How he had respected her grief while gently encouraging her to move forward. The quiet conversations by campfires, his subtle humor, the steadiness of his character. These were not superficial attractions, but something far more substantial. With these thoughts filling her mind, Madeline drifted into sleep, hopeful for what the next day might bring. Morning arrived with bright sunshine streaming through her window. After a breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits with the other boarders, Madeline waited nervously in the parlor for Xavier. When he arrived, promptly at 9 o'clock, she couldn't help the smile that spread across her face. "Good morning," she greeted him, rising from her chair. "You look well rested." "As do you," he replied, his eyes warm as they took in her appearance. She had chosen her best remaining dress, a forest green that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair. Ready to meet the mayor. As they walked through Cheyenne's busy streets, Xavier pointed out various landmarks: the newly built courthouse, the Union Pacific Station, the mercantile where he suggested she could replenish her supplies. Madeline took it all in eagerly, finding the frontier town both intimidating and exciting. The mayor's office was indeed above the general store, accessed by an external staircase. Mayor Hendricks proved to be a portly, energetic man in his 50s with an impressive mustache and an even more impressive ability to talk without seeming to take a breath. A teacher. "By Jove, you're an answer to prayer, Miss Zephyr," he exclaimed after Madeline explained her qualifications. "We've got 37 children of school age in Cheyenne and surrounds, with more arriving by the week. The ladies' auxiliary has been doing what they can, bless them, but they're not trained educators." He rifled through papers on his cluttered desk, eventually producing a document with a flourish. "Here's what the town can offer. $40 a month salary, lodging provided in rooms attached to the new schoolhouse, which I'm proud to say will be completed within the fortnight. Term to begin the first Monday of next month. What say you?" Madeline glanced at Xavier, who gave her an encouraging nod. "It sounds wonderful, Mayor Hendricks," she said. "I would be delighted to accept the position." "Excellent, excellent." The mayor pumped her hand enthusiastically. "Mrs. Whitaker of the Ladies' Auxiliary will want to meet you straight away. She's at the church this morning, organizing the current classroom. Mr. Calloway knows the way, I'm sure." As they left the mayor's office, Madeline felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "It all happened so quickly," she said as they descended the stairs. "Do you think I've made the right decision?" "I think you'll make a fine teacher for Cheyenne's children," Xavier said sincerely, "and $40 a month is a decent wage out here. Will you come with me to meet Mrs. Whitaker?" Madeline asked, "Of course, if you'd like me to." They made their way to the small white church at the end of the main street. Inside, they found an elderly woman with a stern expression directing two younger women in the arrangement of desks in the back room. "Mrs. Whitaker." Madeline approached with her hand extended. "I'm Madeline Zephyr. Mayor Hendricks suggested I introduce myself. I've just accepted the position of teacher for the new school." Mrs. Whitaker's stern expression melted into one of delighted surprise. "Oh, my dear, this is wonderful news indeed." She clasped Madeline's hand in both of hers. "We've been praying for a proper teacher. These children deserve an education, even out here in the wilderness." For the next hour, Mrs. Whitaker showed Madeline the current schoolroom setup, the books and supplies they had managed to acquire, and the plans for the new schoolhouse. Xavier stood back, watching with quiet approval as Madeline engaged enthusiastically with the older woman, asking thoughtful questions and offering suggestions based on her experience. "She's quite remarkable, your young lady, Mrs. Whitaker said to Xavier as Madeline examined the available textbooks. "How long have you two been married?" Xavier's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, we're not married, madam. I just helped Miss Zephyr reach Cheyenne safely." Mrs. Whitaker raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "Well, forgive an old woman's presumption, Mr. Calloway, but I've seen the way you look at her." She patted his arm. "And I've seen the way she looks at you when she thinks no one is watching." Before Xavier could respond, Madeline rejoined them, her eyes bright with excitement. "The books are somewhat outdated, but we can certainly work with them until newer editions can be ordered." "That's the spirit, dear," Mrs. Whitaker approved. "Now I must get back to my duties. The Ladies' Auxiliary meets tomorrow at 2 if you'd care to join us. We can introduce you to some of the mothers of your future pupils." As they left the church, Madeline could barely contain her enthusiasm. "Can you believe it, Zav? Not even a full day in Cheyenne, and I have employment, lodging arranged, and a purpose." She impulsively squeezed his arm. "And it's all thanks to you." "You give me too much credit," Xavier said, though he looked pleased at her happiness. "You'd have found your way eventually." "Perhaps, but it would have been a much lonelier journey." Madeline's voice softened. "Having you beside me has made all the difference." They stood for a moment on the church steps, the morning sun warming their faces. Around them, Cheyenne bustled with activity wagons rolling past, shoppers moving between establishments, workers calling to one another. Yet in that moment, Madeline felt as if they existed in a world of their own. "Madeline," Xavier began, then hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "I was wondering if you might, Miss Zephyr." The moment was broken by a call from across the street. Mayor Hendricks was waving enthusiastically, accompanied by a well-dressed couple. "Come meet Dr. and Mrs. Foster. They have 3 children who will be attending your school." Xavier stepped back, the moment lost. "Go ahead," he said with a small smile. "You should meet your future pupils' parents." "Come with me," Madeline urged. "No, you go on. I have some business to attend to anyway." Xavier tipped his hat. "I'll call on you at the boarding house this evening, if that's acceptable." "Of course," Madeline said, trying to hide her disappointment at their interrupted conversation. "Until this evening, then." The remainder of the day passed in a whirlwind of introductions and preparations. Madeline met several families with school-age children, visited the construction site of the new schoolhouse, and began making lists of supplies she would need. By late afternoon, her head was spinning with names, faces, and plans. She returned to the boarding house to freshen up before supper, wondering what Xavier had been about to say before they were interrupted. His expression had been so earnest, almost vulnerable a side of him she had rarely glimpsed. At 6 o'clock, the boarding house bell rang for supper. Madeline hurried downstairs, hoping Xavier might have arrived early, but he wasn't among the diners. Mrs. Thornton noticed her glancing toward the door, expecting someone. "Dear," the landlady asked kindly. "Mr. Calloway said he might call this evening," Madeline explained, trying to sound casual. Mrs. Thornton nodded knowingly. "A fine man, Mr. Calloway. Known him for years whenever his travels bring him through Cheyenne. Quiet but reliable. The sort who says little but means what he says." "You know him well?" Madeline couldn't resist asking. "Well enough to know he's not one for staying in one place too long," Mrs. Thornton said, then seemed to regret her words when she saw Madeline's expression fall. "Though people can change when they find the right reason," she added gently. After supper, Madeline retired to the boarding house parlor with a book, though she found it difficult to concentrate on the words. Every time the front door opened, she looked up expectantly. As the grandfather clock in the corner struck 8, she began to worry that Xavier wouldn't come after all. At 8:30, just as she was considering retiring to her room, the door opened and Xavier stepped in, removing his hat as he entered. His hair was slightly damp, as if he had recently bathed, and he wore a clean shirt with his usual vest and denims. "I apologize for the late hour," he said as he approached. "My business took longer than expected." "No apology necessary," Madeline said, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. "I'm glad you came." Xavier glanced around the parlor, which they currently had to themselves, though voices could be heard from the dining room where Dr. Palmer and Mr. Simmons were engaged in a game of checkers. "Would you care to step out onto the porch?" Xavier suggested. "It's a fine evening, and I find myself craving fresh air after being indoors most of the day." The porch was indeed pleasant, with a gentle breeze carrying the sense of sage and distant rain. 2 rocking chairs stood invitingly side by side, and they settled into them, the familiar creaking of the rockers creating a soothing rhythm. "How was your day?" Xavier asked. "Did you meet many of your future students?" "A few," Madeline replied. "Most seem eager to learn, though there's one boy, Timothy Foster, who made it quite clear he'd rather be learning to rope cattle than studying arithmetic." Xavier chuckled. "Sounds like a boy after my own heart. I wasn't much for schooling myself at that age." "And yet you're quite well-spoken," Madeline observed. "You must have had some education." "My mother insisted," Xavier acknowledged. "She'd been a schoolteacher before marrying my father. Taught us boys herself when there was no school nearby, which was most of the time on the Texas frontier." They rocked in companionable silence for a few moments, watching as the last light faded from the western sky and stars began to appear. "Madeline," Xavier finally said, his voice low and serious. "There's something I need to tell you." Her heart quickened at his tone. "Yes." "I received a telegram today from Fort Laramie." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I'm still employed as a scout and messenger for the Army. There's a situation developing with some of the Northern Cheyenne. They've asked me to ride out tomorrow." Madeline felt as if a cold hand had gripped her heart. "Tomorrow? For how long? 3 weeks, possibly a month." Xavier's eyes held her steadily. "It's the job I've committed to." "I see." Madeline looked down at her hands, trying to mask her disappointment. "Of course you must go." "You have obligations." "Madeline," Xavier reached across the space between their chairs to touch her hand gently. "I want you to know that I'll be coming back." She looked up, hope flaring in her heart. "You will, if you'll allow it," he said, his voice rougher than usual with emotion. "These past days with you, they've meant more to me than I can properly express." They've meant a great deal to me as well, Madeline admitted softly. Xavier's hand tightened slightly over hers. I know it's sudden. We've known each other less than a week, but I believe. He took a deep breath. I'd like to court you properly when I return, if you're amenable. Joy flooded through Madeline, bright and unexpected. I am very amenable, Mr. Calloway, she said, her voice catching slightly. The smile that spread across Xavier's face transformed his features, erasing the habitual wariness and revealing a warmth that took Madeline's breath away. Then I have something to look forward to, he said. They sat together on the porch until the evening chill forced them inside. Xavier would leave at first light, he explained, but promised to write when possible. As they said goodnight in the boarding house foyer, he took her hand and, with a glance to ensure they weren't observed, pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Until I return, he said simply. Be safe, Xav, she whispered in reply. The next morning, Madeline rose before dawn and hurried downstairs, hoping to see Xavier before he departed. She found him in the stable behind the boarding house, saddling Buck. He looked surprised but pleased to see her. I wanted to wish you Godspeed, she said, suddenly shy in the gray light of early morning. Xavier's expression softened. That means a great deal to me. Without thinking, Madeline reached into her pocket and withdrew a small object, her mother's silver thimble, which she had carried as a keepsake since her death. Take this, she said, pressing it into his palm. For luck. Xavier looked down at the small silver thimble, then carefully tucked it into his shirt pocket close to his heart. I'll guard it well, he promised. See that you do, Madeline said, trying for lightness despite the tightness in her throat. And guard yourself as well. I will return, Madeline, Xavier said, his voice holding absolute certainty. You have my word. With that, he mounted Buck and, with a final tip of his hat, rode out of the stable yard. Madeline watched until he disappeared from sight, then slowly made her way back to the boarding house, already counting the days until his return. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity for Madeline. The new schoolhouse was completed ahead of schedule, allowing her to move into the attached living quarters 3 days before classes were to begin. The space was small but well constructed, with a bedroom, sitting room, and tiny kitchen. After weeks of traveling and boarding, having her own space felt like a luxury. The ladies' auxiliary, led by the formidable Mrs. Whittaker, had furnished the quarters with donated items: a bed with a patchwork quilt, a small sofa, a desk for grading papers, and a rocking chair by the window. They also helped Madeline arrange the classroom, setting up desks in neat rows and hanging maps and alphabet charts on the walls. The school itself was a single large room with tall windows that let in ample light. A pot-bellied stove stood in one corner for the coming winter months, and a modest bell tower crowned the roof. It was far simpler than the Philadelphia Academy where Madeline had previously taught, but she found herself taking immense pride in the little schoolhouse. On the Monday morning when classes officially began, 32 students ranging in age from 6 to 16 filed into the schoolhouse. They were a diverse group, the children of merchants and laborers, ranchers and railroad workers. Some were neatly dressed in their Sunday best, while others wore patched clothing that had clearly been handed down through several siblings. Good morning, children, Madeline greeted them, striving to project confidence despite her nervousness. I am Miss Zephyr, and I have the privilege of being your teacher. Those first days of teaching were exhausting but deeply satisfying. Madeline quickly learned to adapt her Eastern education methods to the realities of frontier schooling. Some of her older students could only attend sporadically due to ranch work or family obligations. Others had received so little prior education that they struggled with basic reading. Yet all showed a hunger for knowledge that touched Madeline deeply. Throughout these busy weeks, her thoughts often turned to Xavier. True to his word, he had written twice brief notes delivered by Army couriers passing through Fort Laramie to Cheyenne. His handwriting was neat but clearly unpracticed, the words straightforward but warm. He spoke of missing their conversations, of the beauty of the high country where he was scouting, and always, of his intention to return to Cheyenne and to her. Madeline kept his letters in the drawer of her bedside table, reading them in the evenings when the schoolhouse was quiet, and she could allow herself to indulge in thoughts of him. She wrote back each time, sending her letters with the regular mail coach to Fort Laramie, uncertain if they would reach him but hoping they might. In her third week of teaching, Madeline received an unexpected visit from Mrs. Thornton. The boarding house keeper arrived at the schoolhouse just as classes were ending for the day, a basket over her arm. "Thought you might appreciate some fresh bread and preserves," Mrs. Thornton said by way of greeting. "Teaching's hungry work, and I doubt you've had time for proper cooking." "How thoughtful," Madeline said gratefully, inviting the older woman into her quarters. "I've been subsisting on rather simple fare, I'm afraid." As Madeline prepared tea, Mrs. Thornton looked around the small living space with approval. "You've made it homey," she observed, noting the books arranged on a small shelf and the vase of wildflowers on the table. "Settling in well, then?" "Very well," Madeline confirmed, setting cups on the table. "The children are wonderful, and the community has been most welcoming." "And any word from Mr. Calloway?" Mrs. Thornton asked, her eyes twinkling as she accepted a cup of tea. Madeline felt herself blush. "2 letters. He's well, though busy with his scouting duties." Mrs. Thornton nodded knowingly. "Never known Xav Calloway to write letters before." "Must be something special about you, my dear." The observation sent a warm flutter through Madeline's chest. "He mentioned he might be returning within the next week or so." "Did he now?" Mrs. Thornton smiled. "Well, that's good news indeed. Though I expect you'll be the first person he calls on when he does." After Mrs. Thornton departed, Madeline found herself gazing out the window, wondering where Xavier was at that moment. Was he riding the high plains, sleeping under the stars, or perhaps already on his way back to Cheyenne and to her? Her reverie was interrupted by a knock at the schoolhouse door. Thinking it might be a student who had forgotten something, Madeline hurried to answer. Instead, she found Mayor Hendricks looking uncharacteristically solemn. "Miss Zephyr," he greeted her, twisting his hat in his hands. "Might I have a word?" "Of course, Mayor," Madeline replied, immediately concerned by his demeanor. "Is something wrong?" "I've just received word from Fort Laramie," the mayor said, following her into the schoolhouse. "There was an incident with the scouting party, ambushed by a band of renegades, according to the report." Madeline felt the blood drain from her face. "Xavier. Is he?" "No definitive word on individual casualties," Mayor Hendricks said quickly. "The telegram only mentioned that there were injuries and that the survivors were making their way back to the fort. I knew of your association with Mr. Calloway and thought you should be informed." Madeline sank onto one of the student desks, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "When will we know more?" "The Army promised to send word once the scouting party reaches Fort Laramie. Should be within a day or 2. Mayor Hendricks awkwardly patted her shoulder. "Try not to worry overmuch, Miss Zephyr. Calloway's a tough one, been through worse scrapes than this, from what I hear." After the mayor left, Madeline returned to her quarters and sat in the rocking chair by the window, her mind racing with fears and possibilities. The uncertainty was agonizing. Xavier could be injured, suffering, or she couldn't bring herself to complete the thought. That night, sleep eluded her entirely. She paced her small quarters, alternating between prayer and anxious speculation. By morning, she was exhausted but determined to maintain normalcy for her students' sake. She taught her classes mechanically, forcing smiles she didn't feel and struggling to focus on the lessons. 2 more days passed with no news. Madeline continued teaching, though each passing hour without word felt like an eternity. The strain began to show in her face, prompting concerned inquiries from Mrs. Whittaker and other community members who had noticed her distress. On the afternoon of the 3rd day after Mayor Hendricks's visit, Madeline was writing spelling words on the blackboard when she heard the schoolhouse door open. Thinking it was the wind, she didn't immediately turn around. School seems to agree with you, Miss Zephyr, a familiar voice said from behind her. The chalk slipped from Madeline's fingers as she spun around. Xavier stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, a tired smile on his face. He looked thinner than when she had last seen him, and there was a fresh scar along his jawline, but he was alive and standing before her. "Zav," she whispered, hardly daring to believe her eyes. The children, sensing something significant, had gone completely silent, watching with wide eyes as their teacher stared at the stranger in the doorway. "Class," Madeline said, her voice unsteady, "please continue copying your spelling words. I need to speak with Mr. Calloway for a moment." She stepped outside, closing the door behind her. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, drinking in the sight of one another after weeks apart. Then, propriety forgotten, Madeline threw her arms around him, burying her face against his shoulder. "I heard there was an ambush," she said, her voice muffled against his coat. "I've been so worried." Xavier's arms tightened around her. "I'm sorry to have caused you distress," he said softly. "The attack came without warning. 2 men were lost, 3 others wounded. We made it back to the fort 3 days ago." Madeline pulled back slightly to look at his face, noting the fatigue in his eyes and the new lines around his mouth. "And you, are you injured?" "Nothing serious," he assured her, his hand coming up to touch the fresh scar on his jaw. "This looks worse than it is. I'm more tired than hurt." Relief washed over Madeline in a dizzying wave. "You're here now," she said simply. "That's what matters." Xavier's expression softened as he looked at her. "I thought of you every day," he admitted, "kept your thimble close. Might have saved my life, deflected a bullet that would have struck a more vital area." Madeline's eyes widened. "Truly," he nodded, reaching into his shirt pocket to produce the silver thimble. It was indeed dented on one side. "Lucky charm, just as you said." The schoolhouse door creaked open and a small face peered out. "Miss Zephyr," Timothy Foster called. "Billy Simmons says we can go home now since you're busy with your bow." Madeline felt her face flush scarlet. "Absolutely not, Timothy. Back to your spelling words this instant." The door quickly closed, but not before they heard excited whispers from within. Xavier chuckled, the sound warming Madeline's heart. "I should let you get back to your pupils," he said, though he made no move to leave. "May I call on you this evening? There's much I'd like to discuss." "Yes," Madeline said without hesitation. "Classes end at 4. I'll be free after that." Xavier nodded, reluctantly stepping back. "Until then." As he turned to go, Madeline called after him, "Zav." When he looked back, she said simply, "I'm very glad you kept your word." His smile reached his eyes this time, erasing some of the fatigue from his features. "As am I, Madeline, as am I." The remaining hours of the school day passed with excruciating slowness. Madeline struggled to maintain her students' attention, as they were far more interested in speculating about Miss Zephyr's caller than in their spelling and arithmetic. By the time she dismissed them at 4 o'clock, the children had concocted elaborate romantic theories that would have made Madeline blush had she overheard them. She hurried through straightening the classroom and retreated to her quarters to freshen up. She changed from her teaching dress into a simpler blue frock that she knew brought out the color of her eyes, and loosened her hair from its severe teaching bun into a softer style. At precisely 5:30, a knock sounded at her door. Madeline took a deep breath to calm her racing heart before opening it. Xavier stood on the threshold, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt. He held a small bunch of wildflowers in one hand. "These aren't much," he said, offering them somewhat self-consciously. "But they reminded me of the flowers we saw along the trail when we were traveling together." Madeline accepted them with genuine pleasure. "They're beautiful, thank you. Please come in." Her quarters, which had seemed adequate until now, suddenly felt very small with Xavier's presence filling the space. He removed his hat, looking around with interest at the simple furnishings and the personal touches Madeline had added. "It suits you," he said approvingly. "Practical but with touches of beauty." "Thank you," Madeline replied, placing the wildflowers in a small jar of water. "Would you care for some tea or coffee perhaps? Coffee would be welcome if it's not too much trouble. As Madeline busied herself with preparing coffee, Xavier settled into the chair by the window. There was an easy familiarity between them, as if the weeks apart had been merely days. "How do you find teaching in Cheyenne?" Xavier asked as she handed him a steaming cup. "Challenging but rewarding," Madeline answered, taking the rocking chair opposite him. "The children are eager to learn, though their previous education has been somewhat haphazard." "How was your journey back from Fort Laramie?" "Uneventful, thankfully," Xavier said, his eyes never leaving her face. "I pushed harder than I should have, eager to return." The simple admission sent warmth spreading through Madeline's chest. "I'm glad you did." They talked for a while about the events of the past weeks, Madeline's experiences with her new students and the community, Xavier's scouting mission, and the ambush that had nearly cost him his life. As twilight deepened outside the window, their conversation grew more personal. "I've been thinking a great deal during these weeks apart," Xavier said, setting his empty coffee cup aside. "About my life, my future, about you." Madeline's heart quickened. "Have you?" "Yes." Xavier leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I told you before I left that I wanted to court you properly. I still do more than ever, but I want you to understand what that might mean." "Tell me," Madeline encouraged softly. Xavier took a deep breath. "I've lived a wandering life for many years. It's all I've known since I was a young man. But lately I've felt restless in a different way, tired of always moving on, never having a place that's truly mine." He met her eyes directly. "Meeting you has crystallized something I've been feeling for some time. I want to build something lasting, Madeline. A home, a life that means something." "And what would that look like?" Madeline asked, hardly daring to hope what his answer might be. "I've had an offer," Xavier said, "from a rancher named Thornton, Mrs. Thornton's brother-in-law. He's getting on in years, looking for someone to manage his operation with an eye toward eventually taking over. It would mean staying in one place, putting down roots." "In Cheyenne?" Madeline couldn't keep the hope from her voice. "Just outside town," Xavier confirmed. "Close enough that." He hesitated, then continued with determination. "Close enough that a man might call on a lady teacher without too much difficulty." Madeline smiled, joy bubbling up inside her. "That sounds very convenient." "It does, doesn't it?" Xavier's expression grew serious again. "Before I give Thornton my answer, I wanted to know how you might feel about such an arrangement, about me staying in Cheyenne, about us seeing more of each other." "I would like that very much," Madeline said, her voice soft but certain. "In fact, I can think of nothing I would like more." The smile that spread across Xavier's face was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. He reached across the space between them to take her hand in his. "Then I'll tell Thornton yes in the morning." They sat together as darkness fell completely outside, talking of possibilities and plans, dreams and hopes. When propriety dictated that Xavier should take his leave, he did so reluctantly. At the door, he turned to Madeline one last time. "May I call on you tomorrow evening? Perhaps we might take a walk through town, let people see us together." Madeline understood what he was asking, a public acknowledgement of their courtship. "I would be honored," she replied. Xavier hesitated, then slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, leaned down and placed a gentle kiss on her cheek. "Until tomorrow, Madeline." "Until tomorrow, Xav," she whispered in return. The following day, Madeline found it nearly impossible to focus on teaching. Her mind constantly wandered to the evening ahead and the new chapter that seemed to be opening in her life. The children, perceptive as always, noticed her distraction and exchanged knowing glances. "Is Mr. Calloway coming back today, Miss Zephyr?" Little Emma Parker asked during the afternoon reading lesson. "That is not an appropriate topic for school discussion, Emma," Madeline replied, trying to sound stern despite the blush she could feel rising to her cheeks. "My ma says he's sweet on you," another child chimed in. "Says it's about time he settled down with a good woman." "Children, please," Madeline clapped her hands for attention. "Return to your reading immediately." Despite her embarrassment, Madeline couldn't help but feel a flutter of pleasure at the community's apparent approval of Xavier's interest in her. In such a small town, their courtship would be public knowledge within days, if it wasn't already. That evening, Xavier arrived punctually at her door, hat in hand and looking more relaxed than she had ever seen him. He had secured the position with Thornton's ranch, he informed her as they set out for their walk, and would begin the following week. "It will be an adjustment," he admitted as they strolled down Cheyenne's main street. "Having a fixed schedule, responsibilities that keep me in one place, but I find myself looking forward to it." "Change can be difficult," Madeline agreed, acutely aware of the curious glances from townsfolk as they passed. "But it can also bring unexpected joy." Xavier's hand brushed against hers, then tentatively took hold of it, like meeting a schoolteacher beside a lonely grave marker. "Exactly like that," Madeline replied, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. Over the following weeks, their courtship progressed with a steady, unhurried pace that suited them both. Xavier called on Madeline 3 evenings a week, sometimes taking her for walks through town, other times simply sitting with her on the schoolhouse porch, talking as the sun set. On Sundays, they attended church together, then often joined other community members for a shared meal afterward. Xavier proved to be a natural at ranch management, his years of experience with horses and cattle serving him well in his new position. Thornton, the aging rancher, quickly came to rely on his judgment and skill. For the first time in his adult life, Xavier found himself establishing roots, becoming part of a community rather than merely passing through it. Madeline thrived as Cheyenne's teacher, earning the respect of parents and the devotion of her pupils. Her classroom became known as a place of both discipline and warmth, where children were challenged to achieve their best while being supported in their efforts. As autumn turned toward winter, with the first snowflakes beginning to dust the plains, Xavier and Madeline's relationship deepened. Their conversations turned increasingly toward the future, discussing hopes and plans with a shared understanding that their lives had become intertwined. On a crisp November evening, as they sat together on the schoolhouse porch wrapped in blankets against the chill, Xavier turned to Madeline with an unusually serious expression. "I have something to show you," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. He withdrew a small leather pouch and emptied its contents into his palm, her mother's silver thimble, now mounted on a simple silver chain. "I had the silversmith in town repair the dent and make it into something you could wear, if you'd like to have it back." Madeline touched the thimble gently. "It's beautiful, Xav, but I gave it to you." "And now I'm giving it back," he said softly, "along with something else if you'll accept it." From his other pocket, he produced a small velvet box. Madeline's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small diamond that caught the last light of the setting sun. "Madeline Zephyr," Xavier said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "These past months have been the happiest of my life. You've shown me that home isn't a place but a person, someone who understands you, challenges you, makes you want to be better than you are." He took her hand in his. "I love you, Madeline. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of joy filled Madeline's eyes. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Xav, I will." Xavier slipped the ring onto her finger, then gently placed the necklace with her mother's thimble around her neck. "A reminder," he said, "of how our journey together began." "At a grave marker beside a lonely trail," Madeline said softly, touching the thimble. "Who would have thought it would lead us here?" Xavier drew her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a tender first kiss that held both promise and passion. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I think perhaps your father knew what he was doing when he brought you west," he murmured, "bringing you to where you needed to be." "To where we both needed to be," Madeline corrected gently. They were married on Christmas Eve in Cheyenne's small church, with snow falling gently outside the windows and candles casting a warm glow over the assembled community. Mrs. Whittaker and the ladies' auxiliary had decorated the church with pine boughs and red ribbons, while Mrs. Thornton had organized a wedding feast that would be remembered in Cheyenne for years to come. Madeline wore a simple ivory dress that the town's seamstress had created especially for the occasion. Around her neck hung the silver thimble on its chain, a reminder of the journey that had brought her to this moment. Xavier, standing tall and proud at the altar, wore a new suit that transformed the rugged scout into a distinguished gentleman, though the quiet strength in his eyes remained unchanged. As they exchanged their vows, Madeline thought of her father and the dream that had brought them west. Though he hadn't lived to see the forests of Oregon, his journey had led her to a happiness she could never have found in Philadelphia. In that moment, she felt certain that he was watching, approving of the life she had found. The newlyweds moved into a small house that Xavier had built on Thornton's ranch property, close enough to town that Madeline could continue teaching. It was a simple structure, but solid and well-crafted, with large windows that offered views of the rolling plains and distant mountains. Winter passed in a cocoon of newlywed bliss, the couple finding joy in establishing their home and their life together. Xavier proved to be a thoughtful, tender husband, while Madeline brought warmth and purpose to his formerly solitary existence. Their differences complemented each other, his practical frontier skills balancing her more scholarly nature, her optimism softening the wariness years of wandering had instilled in him. When spring arrived, bringing new growth to the prairie, Madeline shared news that filled their home with even greater joy. They would welcome a child before the year's end. Xavier's reaction stunned silence, followed by a smile of such complete happiness that it transformed his face was something Madeline knew she would treasure forever. "A family," he said in wonder, his hand gently resting on her still flat stomach. "Our family." "Yes," Madeline agreed, covering his hand with her own. "A new chapter in our story." As summer bloomed across the Wyoming territory, Madeline continued teaching, though she had already notified the town council that she would need a replacement by autumn. Her students were disappointed but excited about Miss Zephyr's baby, as they called it, already bringing small gifts and handmade items for the expected child. Xavier threw himself into preparations, adding a nursery to their home and crafting a cradle from pine with his own hands. His protective instincts, always strong, became even more pronounced as Madeline's pregnancy progressed. Yet there was a newfound softness to him as well, a gentle tenderness that emerged when he spoke to their unborn child in the quiet evenings as they sat together before the fire. Their daughter, Catherine Grace Calloway, arrived on a crisp October morning with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined spirit. Xavier, who had faced dangers from hostile warriors to raging blizzards without flinching, found himself completely undone by the tiny perfection of his daughter's fingers and the trust in her newborn gaze. "She's magnificent," he whispered, holding her with careful reverence. "Like her mother." Madeline, exhausted but radiant, watched the man who had once seemed so solitary and self-contained cradle their child with infinite tenderness. "She's going to have you wrapped around her little finger," she predicted with a smile. "Already does," Xavier admitted without shame. Life settled into a new rhythm with Catherine's arrival. Xavier continued managing Thornton's ranch, gradually taking on more responsibility as the older man's health began to decline. Madeline devoted herself to motherhood, finding as much fulfillment in teaching her daughter as she had in her classroom. When Catherine was 6 months old, Xavier received news that would once again reshape their future. Old Thornton, as he was affectionately known, had passed away peacefully in his sleep. His will, read a week later, revealed that he had left the ranch to Xavier, citing his integrity, hard work, and vision for the land's future. He had no children of his own, Xavier explained to Madeline as they absorbed the news. Said I was the son he wished he'd had. He looked around at the modest house they had made their home. It's a significant responsibility, Madeline. The ranch is substantial, over 2,000 acres. Do you want to accept it? Madeline asked, watching his expression carefully. Xavier was silent for a long moment, considering. Yes, he finally said. I do. This land, it gets under your skin, becomes part of you. He looked at her intently. But only if you're willing. It would mean our lives would be tied to this place. Madeline smiled, bouncing Catherine gently in her arms. Our lives are already tied to this place, Zav. It's where we found each other, where our daughter was born, where we've built our home. She reached for his hand. I can think of nowhere I'd rather be. Relief and gratitude flooded Xavier's expression. Then we'll make this ranch something to be proud of, something to pass on to Catherine someday if she wants it. The Calloway Ranch, as it came to be known, prospered under Xavier's management. He implemented innovative methods he had observed in his traveling days, expanded the cattle operation, and established a reputation for fair dealing that earned respect throughout the territory. As Cheyenne grew from frontier outpost to established city, the ranch grew alongside it, becoming one of the region's most successful operations. Madeline found ways to contribute her own talents to their enterprise. She kept the ranch's accounts with meticulous accuracy, corresponded with cattle buyers from as far away as Chicago, and established a small school on the ranch for the children of their growing number of ranch hands. Catherine thrived in this environment, growing into a curious, adventurous child with her father's affinity for horses and her mother's love of books. When she was 4, she gained a brother, James Xavier Calloway, a sturdy boy whose arrival completed their family circle. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Xavier surprised Madeline with a special gift, a wooden cross, carefully crafted to match the one that had marked her father's grave. I thought we might place it in the garden, he explained as she unwrapped it. A memorial to your father here on our land, so Catherine and James will know their grandfather's story and how he brought you west. Tears filled Madeline's eyes as she traced the simple, beautiful craftsmanship. It's perfect, Zav, thank you. They placed the cross that afternoon in the flower garden Madeline had established behind their home, which had grown from the original small structure into a comfortable farmhouse befitting the ranch's success. Xavier had carved her father's name and dates into the wood, along with the simple epitaph. His journey led others home. As twilight fell, the family gathered around the cross, Xavier with his arm around Madeline, Catherine solemnly placing wildflowers at its base, baby James watching with wide eyes from his mother's arms. Madeline thought of that day nearly 6 years earlier when she had sat alone beside her father's grave, consumed by grief and uncertainty, until a quiet cowboy had sat beside her without a word. Thank you, Papa, she whispered to the evening breeze, for bringing me where I needed to be. Xavier's arm tightened around her shoulders, and she leaned into his strength, grateful for the journey that had brought them together and the life they had built from an unexpected beginning beside a lonely trail.